You're sitting in a quiet corner of a crowded room, carefully folding your edges so you don't take up too much space. You lower your pitch before you speak, soften your gaze so it doesn't feel like a demand, swallow the question hovering on your tongue to avoid shifting the weight of a conversation that only ever orbits one person's gravity. You tell yourself this is just harmony, just empathy, just love in action. But deep beneath your ribs, a hollow is quietly expanding, a slow, silent erosion you can't name, and you can't explain why every bond, every friendship, every partnership eventually leaves you standing completely alone in your own home, holding a cup of tea that's gone cold, while the world moves on without you. What if that isolation isn't a punishment at all, but a precise neurological signal, a biological whisper begging you to stop collapsing into rooms that were never engineered to hold your weight? If this channel has helped you understand yourself even a little better, please hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps more people find this content who need it. Because the architecture of this pattern runs deeper than habit, deeper than personality, and what we're about to map will fundamentally change how you navigate every relationship moving forward. Making yourself small is never truly about humility, about being easy to love, about keeping the peace. It is a documented trauma response, a survival strategy wired into your nervous system long before you had the language to name it. When sensitive nervous systems learn to shrink to survive, to avoid conflict, to soothe volatility, to absorb the unspoken demands of others, they don't just quiet their voice. They actively suppress the very mirror neurons required to detect genuine reciprocity, to sense when care is flowing both ways. Here's what most people misunderstand. You are not inherently flawed for craving deep mutual connection. You have simply been conditioned, through years of subtle and overt messaging, to mistake your own erasure for safety, your silence for strength. The solitude that follows is not a life sentence. It is your psyche, your brilliant, protective inner wisdom, forcefully clearing the static. And here is where it gets really interesting. Your loneliness is actually your biological immune system activating, burning away the parasitic dynamics that only feed on your invisibility, your quiet compliance, your endless capacity to hold space for everyone but yourself. Trait 1 is the architecture of self-erasure. You treat your boundaries like structural walls in a building you're desperately trying to gut for someone else's comfort, someone else's narrative, someone else's unresolved pain. You absorb the tension in the room, the subtle gaslighting that makes you question your own memory, the unrelenting emotional labor of managing everyone's moods while your own needs gather dust in a corner you've agreed never to enter. You convince yourself that if you just become porous enough, flexible enough, small enough, the storm will finally pass and you'll be loved for your effort. But neuroscience confirms that chronic self-minimization triggers measurable shrinkage in the anterior cingulate cortex, the exact neural hub responsible for emotional discernment, for knowing when to stay and when to walk away. But here's the twist. You are not failing to hold your own ground. You are succeeding, brilliantly and tragically, at protecting a system that only survives when you vanish. That is not devotion. That is systemic nervous system exhaustion, wearing a mask of loyalty. Trait 2 is the mirror neuron overload that traps you in deeply asymmetrical bonds. Relationships where you are the container and they are the content. When you constantly scan the space to gauge safety, to read the micro-expressions, to anticipate the shift in tone before it happens, your brain literally mirrors every fracture, every unmet need, every hidden wound in the people around you. You feel their unspoken resentment before it reaches their lips. You carry the invisible weight of their expectations until your spirit feels permanently depleted, like a well drawn dry by hands that never learned to offer water in return. Research on empathic overattunement proves that highly feeling individuals will downregulate their own physiological signals, their hunger, their fatigue, their hurt, to maintain group cohesion, even at the direct, devastating cost of personal collapse. This is where the real danger begins. When you confuse emotional absorption for genuine intimacy, when you mistake being needed for being valued, you quietly invite energy vampires who mistake your quiet endurance for an endless reservoir, your empathy for an invitation to take. Trait 3 is the drought of authenticity, the slow starvation of your true voice. Picture a coastal forest where every tree bends relentlessly toward a single artificial light, slowly starving the rich, intricate mycorrhizal network beneath the soil. The very system that allows trees to share nutrients, to warn of danger, to thrive in community. That is your relational landscape when you perform harmony instead of practicing truth. When you swallow your clarity to avoid shattering someone else's illusion of control, their fragile sense of being right. You become an expert in the grammar of appeasement, fluent in the dialect of delay. And what nobody tells you is that your isolation in this phase is actually a biological reset protocol, a necessary fallow season. Your nervous system is starving for the nutrient of honest friction, for the clean burn of a boundary held with love. Now here's the part that makes this genuinely dangerous to certain people. Your quiet compliance, your predictable accommodation, signals that you will never enforce a hard boundary, that your no is just a suggestion waiting to be negotiated. That is not weakness. That is information waiting to be acted upon. Trait 4 is the cognitive dissonance loop that keeps you anchored to the wrong people. The dynamics that drain you while convincing you it's your job to fix them. You feel the visceral mismatch between their words and their actions, between the promise and the pattern. Yet you rationalize the gap. You make excuses. You tell yourself that patience, that more love, that better communication will eventually bridge the divide. But neurobiology reveals that prolonged exposure to emotional inconsistency, to intermittent reinforcement, creates a stress hormone cascade, cortisol, adrenaline, that dulls your prefrontal cortex, the very region responsible for clear judgment, for long-term planning, for saying, "This is not working." You become chemically dependent on the very patterns that drain you, addicted to the hope that this time will be different. You have been mistaking trauma bonding for depth, intensity for intimacy. When your nervous system finally stops bracing, finally exhales the tension it's been holding for years, you realize the exhaustion was never about love. It was about survival. That is not coldness leaving the room. That is sovereignty quietly taking its seat. Trait 5 is the slow, sacred realization that peace cannot be negotiated with people who profit from your shrinkage, who benefit from your silence, who mistake your empathy for an endless supply. You stop explaining your need for space. You stop apologizing for your natural rhythm, your need for quiet, your requirement for reciprocity. You simply step out of the echo chamber, out of the loop of justification, and let the silence do its work. The work of revealing what was always there. The betrayal you feared, the abandonment you braced for, transforms into a precise filtration mechanism, a loving edit that removes what was never meant to stay. Documented clinical outcomes show that sensitive individuals who choose permanent distance over chronic accommodation, who prioritize self-preservation over performative peace, experience a measurable restoration in heart rate variability within 90 days, a biological marker of nervous system regulation, of returning home to yourself. You do not walk away to punish them. You walk away to reclaim the territory you surrendered, the voice you muted, the life you postponed. The quiet you feared is actually the exact frequency required for healing. Trait 6 is the sovereign recalibration of your own worth. The moment you finally recognize that your empathy was never the liability, the problem, the flaw. The environment was the mismatch. The dynamic was the wound. You stop shrinking your needs, your dreams, your authentic expression to fit inside the narrow tolerances of fractured dynamics, of people who only have room for a version of you that serves them. You begin to demand resonance, not just presence, depth, not just proximity. Here's a fun fact that genuinely blew my mind. Longitudinal studies on post-traumatic growth confirm that empaths who establish firm, loving relational boundaries after periods of necessary isolation experience a 41% increase in baseline dopamine regulation within 6 months. A neurochemical shift that supports motivation, joy, and the courage to connect from a place of wholeness, not lack. You were never meant to survive by disappearing. You were meant to thrive by becoming fully visible, fully felt, fully free. The soil is finally ready, nourished by your tears and your truth, for your true shape to take root and rise. And here is the truth nobody tells you. The aloneness you have been carrying, the quiet ache that follows you from room to room, is not a verdict on your worth, your lovability, your place in this world. It is the exact distance you had to travel to stop mistaking abandonment for your natural state, to stop confusing being chosen for being used. You did not end up isolated because you were too much, too sensitive, too feeling. You ended up isolated because you were too whole, too deep, too real for the fragments they were handing out, for the shallow connections they were willing to offer. That hollow ache beneath your sternum is not emptiness. It is the echo of a boundary you are finally strong enough to enforce, a sanctuary you are finally brave enough to build. When you stop performing peace to keep collapsing systems intact, when you stop shrinking to fit inside spaces that were never meant to hold you, you step into a quiet sovereignty that cannot be manipulated, drained, or negotiated away. You are not lost. You are simply done. Done with the performance. Done with the apology for existing. Done with the belief that love requires your disappearance. So here's what I want to leave you with today. Your sensitivity was never the wound. The architecture you built around it to survive, the walls, the silence, the smallness, was. You have already endured the heaviest part of the collapse, the most painful part of the awakening. The rest is simply learning, day by day, breath by breath, to inhabit the wide, quiet, sacred space you fought so hard to clear. Which trait resonated most deeply with your own history? Have you ever recognized this exact pattern in your past relationships, your friendships, your family dynamics? I read every single one. Your story matters. If someone you care about is still folding themselves into corners, still muting their voice, still believing that love requires their shrinkage, share this with them. It might be the permission, the mirror, the gentle nudge they need to finally stand at full height, to finally take up the space they were born to occupy. Walk gently. Breathe deeply. You are exactly where you are meant to be.